Dr. Angela Carter walked through the airport, rolling her small black suitcase behind her. The long hours at the hospital had left her exhausted, and all she wanted was to sit back, relax, and enjoy her flight home. She had worked for years to reach this level of success. A top neurosurgeon, respected in her field, traveling first class as a well-earned luxury. The terminal buzzed with people rushing to their gates, announcements echoing overhead. Angela pulled out her ticket to check her seat number again -2A, first class. She smiled to herself, already imagining the soft leather seat, the warm towel, and a quiet nap before landing. As she boarded the plane, she stepped into the first-class cabin, her heels clicking softly on the carpet. The space was bright and spacious, with large seats separated by wide armrests. It was a world away from the crowded rows of economy class. Angela walked toward her assigned seat, but as she approached, she noticed something odd. A man was already sitting there. He was in his mid-50s, wearing an expensive-looking navy suit. He looked comfortable, flipping through a magazine with one leg crossed over the other. She paused for a moment, thinking maybe she had made a mistake. She glanced at the seat number again -2A. Yes, this was definitely her seat. Clearing her throat politely, she said, "Excuse me, I believe this is my seat." The man barely looked up. He turned a page in his magazine, then gave her a quick glance, as if surprised to see her standing there. "Are you sure?" he asked, his tone casual but dismissive. Angela remained calm. She had dealt with all kinds of people in her profession, from panicked patients to arrogant doctors. "Yes," she said, holding up her ticket. "2A, that's my seat." The man sighed, shaking his head slightly. "There must be some mistake," he said. "You should check your ticket again." Angela blinked, surprised. She knew what was happening, but she refused to let it bother her. Keeping her voice steady, she said, "I have checked. This is my seat." The man frowned, finally closing his magazine. He looked her up and down, as if trying to figure out if she truly belonged there. Then he leaned back in the seat and said, "I've always flown first class on this airline. Maybe you were given the wrong boarding pass." Angela took a deep breath. She could feel the eyes of other passengers watching. Some glanced over their newspapers, others pretended not to listen, but were clearly paying attention. Before she could respond, a flight attendant walked up. She was a young woman with a friendly smile, her uniform crisp and neat. "Is there a problem here?" she asked politely. Angela turned to her. "Yes, this gentleman is sitting in my seat." She handed over her boarding pass. The flight attendant took one look at it and nodded. "Yes, you're in 2A, she confirmed. Then she turned to the man. "Sir, may I see your ticket, please?" The man hesitated. Then, with a heavy sigh, he reached into his pocket and pulled out his ticket. The flight attendant examined it for a second, then looked back at him. "Sir, your seat is actually in economy -23B." For a moment, there was silence. The man's face twitched slightly, but he didn't move. Instead, he chuckled, shaking his head as if the situation was ridiculous. "That can't be right," he said. "I always fly first class." The flight attendant remained professional, though her polite smile didn't waver. "I'm sorry, sir, but this ticket is for economy class. I'll be happy to help you find your seat." Angela stood quietly, waiting. She had seen these situations before. People who felt entitled to special treatment, who didn't believe someone like her belonged in a place of luxury. But she wasn't going to argue. She had paid for this seat, and she had every right to sit there. The other passengers watched, some whispering to each other. A man in the next row raised an eyebrow, as if he couldn't believe what was happening. A woman across the aisle sighed and shook her head. Still, the man didn't move. Instead, he tried a different approach. "Listen," he said, turning back to Angela. "I'm already settled here. Why don't you take my seat in economy? It's not a bad spot, really." Angela let out a small laugh, not out of amusement, but in disbelief. "I'm sorry, but no," she said firmly. "I purchased a first-class ticket, and I intend to sit in my assigned seat." The tension in the cabin grew. The flight attendant's smile faded slightly. "Sir, I'll have to ask you to move now," she said. Angela remained standing, waiting for what would happen next. She knew one thing for sure. She wasn't going anywhere. The man, still sitting in Angela's seat, let out a small sigh, shaking his head as if this entire situation was beneath him. He glanced at the flight attendant, then back at Angela, and finally down at his own ticket again, as if hoping it would somehow change. "Are you sure there isn't a mistake?" he asked again, this time with a slight edge in his voice. The flight attendant remained professional, though her polite smile had faded just a little. "No mistake, sir. Your ticket is for seat 23B in economy class." Angela waited patiently, her expression calm but firm. She had spent years in medical school, long nights in operating rooms, and countless hours earning her success. She wasn't about to let anyone take away something she had rightfully paid for. The man, still unwilling to move, let out a small chuckle. "This is ridiculous," he muttered. He looked around, as if expecting support from the other first-class passengers. But most of them avoided eye contact, pretending to focus on their phones, newspapers, or the flight safety booklet. They had seen enough awkward situations on flights to know better than to get involved. Then, as if suddenly getting a bright idea, the man turned back to Angela and smiled in a way that felt more like a negotiation than an apology. "Look," he said, gesturing casually. "I'm already settled here. I have my magazine, my drink is coming soon, and I'm really comfortable. Why don't we just make this easy? You can take my seat in economy, and I'll stay here." Angela blinked. For a second, she wondered if she had heard him correctly. Did he really just suggest that she give up her seat, the one she had paid for, just to make things easy for him? She let out a small breath and shook her head. "No," she said simply. "I paid for this seat, and I would like to sit in it." The man's smile vanished. He looked genuinely surprised, as if he couldn't believe she had refused. "Come on," he said, his tone shifting from friendly to slightly impatient. "It's just a seat. It's not a big deal." Angela crossed her arms. "Then why don't you take your assigned seat?" For a second, the man didn't have an answer. He just stared at her, his face tightening. He glanced at the flight attendant again, as if expecting her to step in and fix the situation in his favor. But the flight attendant only stood her ground. "Sir, if you do not move to your assigned seat, we will have to involve airport security," she said firmly. A few passengers nearby exchanged quiet looks. Some were clearly entertained, others annoyed that the flight was being delayed because of this unnecessary argument. The man exhaled sharply, running a hand through his neatly combed hair. He looked around the cabin again, then finally back at Angela. "Fine," he muttered under his breath. Angela watched as he slowly stood up, clearly reluctant to leave. He grabbed his expensive-looking briefcase and smoothed his jacket, acting as though he was the victim in this situation. Before he walked away, he turned to Angela one last time. "I hope you enjoy the seat," he said with a forced smile. Angela didn't respond. She simply stepped forward, placed her carry-on in the overhead bin, and sat down. The plush leather seat was just as comfortable as she had imagined. The flight attendant gave her a small, approving nod before walking away to assist other passengers. Meanwhile, the man made his way down the aisle toward economy class. As he walked past rows of seats, the reality of his situation seemed to sink in. First class had large, spacious seats with extra legroom. Economy was packed, with narrow seats and barely any space to stretch. When he finally reached row 23, he realized that his assigned seat wasn't just an economy. It was a middle seat between two other passengers. Angela didn't look back. She simply leaned back in her seat, adjusted her headrest, and prepared to enjoy the flight. She had earned this, and no one was going to take it away from her. As Angela settled into her seat, she took a deep breath and allowed herself to relax. The first-class cabin was peaceful, with soft lighting, and the faint sound of quiet conversations around her. A flight attendant soon arrived with a tray of drinks, offering her a refreshing glass of orange juice before takeoff. She sipped it slowly, appreciating the moment. It had been a long, exhausting week at the hospital, and she was looking forward to this flight being a smooth and quiet one. But just as she was starting to feel comfortable, she heard a loud voice from behind her. "This is unacceptable." The man from earlier was speaking, his voice carrying through the cabin. Even though he was now seated in economy class, he was still making a fuss. Angela closed her eyes for a moment, hoping the situation would die down on its own. But it didn't. The flight attendants were now trying to calm the man down. "Sir, please lower your voice," one of them said in a firm but polite tone. "We need all passengers to be seated so we can prepare for takeoff." Angela didn't turn around, but she could hear the frustration in the man's voice. "I shouldn't be sitting back here," he argued. "I always fly first class. This is clearly some kind of mistake. How is this even happening?" A few passengers around him shifted uncomfortably. Some rolled their eyes, while others pretended to ignore the scene. A young woman in the aisle seat next to him sighed, adjusting her earbuds as if trying to block out the noise. The flight attendant remained calm. "Sir, you were assigned seat 23B, and that is where you need to stay." The man let out an irritated chuckle. "You're seriously telling me that she—" He pointed toward first class, though Angela still didn't turn around. "Gets to sit there while I'm stuck back here." Angela took another slow sip of her juice, refusing to react. She had seen people like this before, people who couldn't handle not getting their way. Another passenger, an older gentleman seated across from the man, finally spoke up. "Sir, if you don't want your seat, I'll gladly take it," he said with a small laugh, trying to lighten the mood. "At least you're not stuck in the last row." A few passengers chuckled, but the man didn't find it funny. He crossed his arms, his face red with frustration. At this point, another flight attendant arrived. "Sir, if you continue causing a disturbance, we will have to involve airport security," she said firmly. The man clenched his jaw. It was clear he didn't want to back down, but now he was running out of options. Slowly, he exhaled and leaned back in his seat, muttering something under his breath. Angela finally allowed herself to glance back just once. The man looked miserable, squeezed between two passengers, with barely enough space to move his arms. Turning back, she hid a small smile. Karma had done its job. The flight attendants finished their final checks, and soon the plane was preparing for takeoff. Angela leaned back in her seat, fastened her seatbelt, and prepared to enjoy the peaceful journey ahead. She had fought for her success, worked hard for every achievement, and today she had stood her ground for something as simple as respect. As the plane taxied to the runway, Angela settled deeper into her seat. The soft leather felt comfortable, and the quiet hum of the aircraft was almost soothing. A flight attendant came by, offering her a warm towel, which she gladly accepted. It was a small but nice touch, one of the many reasons she had chosen to fly first class. But just as she was starting to relax, she heard more noise from the economy section behind her. "I need to speak to someone in charge." The familiar voice of the man from earlier rang out. Even with the background noise of the plane, his irritation was clear. Angela sighed, closing her eyes for a moment. Was this man really still trying to argue? A flight attendant quickly walked toward him, trying to keep the situation from getting worse. "Sir, we are about to take off," she said, keeping her voice calm. "I need you to remain seated and follow flight instructions." The man shook his head. "I want an upgrade," he demanded. "I shouldn't be sitting back here. This is unacceptable." A few passengers nearby exchanged amused glances. Some were annoyed, others just tired of the drama. The flight attendant sighed but remained patient. "Sir, the flight is completely full," she explained. "We cannot move you to another seat." Angela couldn't see him, but she imagined the frustrated expression on his face. "This is ridiculous," the man muttered. I've been flying with this airline for years. I should be in first class, not in a middle seat. The flight attendant stayed professional. Sir, your ticket is for economy class. If you wanted a first-class seat, you would have needed to purchase one. There was silence for a moment, as if the man was realizing he had no more excuses left. Then, to everyone's surprise, he made a final desperate attempt. What about her? He said suddenly, pointing toward first class. Maybe she should switch with me. I mean, does she even fly first class often? Angela felt her entire body tense, but she kept her face calm. The flight attendant frowned, clearly taken aback by the suggestion. Sir, her seat was purchased fairly, just like anyone else's. She is not required to give it up for you. Angela remained silent, refusing to give the man the satisfaction of a reaction. At this point, a few passengers had had enough. A man sitting across from Angela let out a loud sigh and turned around in his seat. Buddy, just give it up already, he said, shaking his head. You're making a scene over a seat. A woman a few rows ahead chimed in, chuckling. I fly first class often, and trust me, throwing a tantrum isn't the way to get there. A few others chuckled, while some passengers simply looked annoyed that their flight was being delayed. The man's face turned red. His plan had completely backfired. Instead of getting sympathy, he had embarrassed himself in front of the entire cabin. The flight attendant crossed her arms. Sir, this is your final warning, she said firmly. Either sit down and remain quiet, or we will have to remove you from this flight. Angela could hear the man huffing, clearly frustrated that he had lost this battle. But after a few tense seconds, he finally gave up. Fine, he muttered under his breath, sinking back into his middle seat, arms crossed. Angela didn't look back, but she could feel the energy shift. The other passengers seemed relieved that the situation had finally ended. The flight attendants quickly moved on, finishing their final safety checks. Soon, the pilot's voice came over the speakers, announcing that they were ready for takeoff. Angela leaned back, adjusting her seatbelt. Now, finally, she could enjoy her flight in peace. As the plane began to speed down the runway, Angela took a deep breath and looked out of the window. The city lights below shimmered like tiny stars, growing smaller as the aircraft lifted off into the sky. The familiar feeling of takeoff filled her chest, but this time it came with relief. Finally, some peace. The man from earlier had finally gone quiet, though she could still sense his frustration. But that was no longer her concern. She had fought for what was rightfully hers, and now she could focus on enjoying the flight. A flight attendant soon appeared, offering first-class passengers their choice of meal. Would you like the grilled salmon or the pasta primavera? She asked with a warm smile. Angela glanced at the neatly printed menu in front of her. She appreciated the small details, the fresh ingredients, the perfectly plated dishes. This was exactly why she had chosen to fly first class. I'll have the salmon, please, she said. As the flight attendant noted her order, Angela noticed something unexpected. A few rows behind her, a different flight attendant was serving drinks in economy class. She spotted the man from earlier, still in his middle seat, looking miserable. His arms were crossed, his expression unreadable. But then, something even more surprising happened. The passenger sitting beside him, a young man with glasses, turned toward him and started a conversation. Though Angela couldn't hear their words, she could tell that the young man was being polite, maybe even friendly. At first, the older man barely reacted. He gave short answers, avoiding eye contact. But after a few minutes, his posture changed. His shoulders relaxed just a little, and he slowly started talking back. Angela raised an eyebrow, curious. Could it be that, after all his frustration and entitlement, he was finally realizing that his attitude wasn't helping him? She shook her head, returning her attention to her own meal as it arrived. The salmon was perfectly cooked, the flavors rich and satisfying. She took a bite and let herself fully enjoy the moment. Meanwhile, In the economy section, the conversation between the two men continued. "So, what do you do for a living?" the young man asked. The older man sighed. "Business," he muttered, still sounding a little bitter. "I've been flying first class for years. Never had an issue like this before." The young man nodded. "Yeah, I get it. Flights can be stressful. But you know, things happen. Maybe it's a chance to see things from a different perspective." The older man scoffed. "Perspective?" The young man shrugged. "Yeah, I mean, look at me. I always fly economy because it's what I can afford right now. But I still enjoy my trips. It's all about attitude." The older man didn't respond right away. But after a moment, he let out a small chuckle, the first sign that maybe, just maybe, he was starting to rethink his actions. Angela didn't need to hear the details to understand what was happening. Sometimes, people needed to be humbled before they could grow. As she finished her meal, she pulled out a book from her bag and flipped it open. The words on the page blurred slightly as she thought back to everything that had happened since she boarded the plane. Respect isn't about money or status. It's about how you treat others. As the flight continued its steady climb, the cabin remained calm and quiet. Angela was comfortably tucked into her seat, the soft hum of the engines almost like a lullaby in the background. She leaned back, closing her eyes for a moment, letting her body relax. It had been a long day, and this peaceful moment was exactly what she needed. But soon, something unusual caught her attention. The man who had caused all the trouble earlier was no longer sitting stiffly in his middle seat. His posture had softened, and from where Angela sat, she could see him making an effort to engage with the person sitting next to him. The two were now talking more openly, the conversation seeming less strained than before. Angela raised an eyebrow. Was he actually trying to be friendly now? For the past hour, she had noticed that the man had seemed agitated and uncomfortable. His attempts to move to first class had clearly backfired. He had tried to force his way into a seat he didn't deserve, but now it seemed that he was trying to make the best of the situation. Perhaps he was starting to realize that his frustration had only made things worse for him. The calm demeanor of the young man sitting next to him seemed to be having an effect. Angela couldn't help but wonder what had changed. Was it the realization that he couldn't control everything? Or was it the kindness of a stranger, offering him a moment of understanding? Whatever the reason, the change was noticeable. She turned her attention back to the book in her lap, but her mind kept drifting back to the conversation taking place behind her. She had learned a long time ago that sometimes people only change when they were faced with an uncomfortable truth. And sometimes all it took was a little humility to make someone see things differently. The meal service was finished, and the flight attendants began their rounds, offering drinks to passengers. A stewardess approached Angela with a warm smile. "Would you like some coffee, ma'am?" she asked politely. Angela smiled and accepted, glad to be able to enjoy the rest of the flight in peace. As the minutes ticked by, she found herself glancing back toward the man. He seemed much calmer now, his earlier tension gone. He was chatting animatedly with his seatmate, laughing about something, perhaps a joke, or just the absurdity of the whole situation. Angela couldn't help but feel a small sense of satisfaction. It was clear that the man had learned something valuable over the course of the flight. He had arrived with an attitude of entitlement, demanding to be treated better than others. But now he seemed to have realized that treating others with respect was far more important than anything else. It wasn't about the seat or the class you flew in. It was about how you treated the people around you. As the plane sailed smoothly through the night sky, Angela felt a small sense of pride. She had stood her ground, and in doing so, she had ensured that the principle of respect had been upheld. Sometimes, standing firm was the only way to teach others a lesson they needed to learn. In the seat behind her, the man was still engaged in conversation, laughing along with his seatmate. He seemed more at ease now, more human than before. There was no longer an air of superiority about him, no hint of frustration. It was as if the weight of his earlier behavior had been lifted off his shoulders. For Angela, That was enough. She had witnessed a small but important change, and she felt good knowing that sometimes, even the most difficult situations could lead to a moment of growth. The rest of the flight passed smoothly. Angela spent her time reading, enjoying her coffee, and occasionally glancing back at the man. He was no longer the angry passenger who had tried to take her seat. Now, he seemed like someone who had learned a valuable lesson, one that would stay with him long after the flight was over. As the plane started its descent, Angela felt the familiar tug of gravity pulling her gently back into her seat. She watched out the window as the city below began to come into view. The bright lights of the skyline stretched out in every direction, and she could see the rolling hills and streets below, now quiet in the late hour. It was always a beautiful sight after a long flight. She felt a sense of satisfaction as she looked at the scene, knowing that the journey was almost over. The momentary discomfort of the flight, the noise, the disruption, had faded into the background, and now there was just the peaceful rhythm of the plane heading toward its destination. As the flight attendants went through their final checks, Angela took a slow, deep breath, appreciating the quiet. She had dealt with all sorts of people in her life, but something about this experience had felt different. She wasn't sure why, but she had an undeniable sense of peace now. And then, just as the plane leveled off, she heard a familiar voice from behind. "I just wanted to say, thank you." Angela froze for a moment, surprised. She hadn't expected the man from earlier to speak to her. Slowly, she turned her head, seeing him standing in the aisle a few rows behind her, looking at her with a genuine expression. He had removed his jacket, and his posture was far less stiff than it had been at the beginning of the flight. "I didn't expect to get so worked up earlier," he said, his voice soft but sincere. "I was really out of line, and I know that now. You didn't deserve any of that." Angela was momentarily taken aback by his words. She hadn't expected an apology, especially not after everything that had happened. She wasn't sure what to say at first, but she smiled politely and nodded. "I appreciate that," she said simply. "It's easy to get frustrated when things don't go the way we expect." The man looked at her for a long moment, as if weighing her words carefully. "Yeah, I guess I thought I deserved more because of who I am, or how much I've done. But that doesn't give me the right to treat others poorly." Angela was surprised by how open he was being. The man had initially seemed so wrapped up in his own world, but now he was showing a side of himself that felt more genuine, more human. "I think you've learned a lot in a short amount of time," she said with a small smile. He chuckled softly, rubbing the back of his neck. "I really have. Honestly, I never thought I'd be the person asking for advice, but I've had a lot of time to think during this flight. I've been a bit arrogant, and that's something I need to change." Angela could sense that he was speaking from a place of real realization. It wasn't just an apology because he thought he should say it. It felt like he was truly coming to terms with something deeper. "I think it's hard for people like me to accept that sometimes we need to step back and look at things from a different angle," he continued. "I always thought that being in charge meant always being in control. But it's really about learning to understand others better." Angela nodded thoughtfully. "It's a hard lesson, but a good one. We all have our own journeys to learn from." For a moment, there was silence between them. The plane continued its descent toward the runway, the city below growing ever closer. "I just wanted to say, thank you," he repeated, "for showing me that sometimes you don't need to fight for what you think you deserve. You just need to show respect to others, and things work out better in the end." Angela smiled, feeling the quiet warmth in her chest. "You're welcome," she said softly. As the plane began its final approach, Angela felt a sense of contentment she hadn't expected when the flight had started. There was something deeply fulfilling about witnessing change in another person. Sometimes it wasn't just about standing your ground. It was about letting others see the truth and giving them the space to change. As the wheels of the plane touched down on the runway with a soft jolt, Angela felt a quiet sense of pride. Not only had she stood up for herself, but she had also witnessed someone else take a step toward growth. The plane touched down smoothly, and the gentle rumble of the wheels against the runway signaled that the flight had finally come to an end. Angela adjusted her seatbelt, feeling a sense of relief wash over her. The journey had been a long one, but it had also been full of lessons for herself and for others. As the aircraft taxied toward the gate, the cabin lights brightened, and passengers started to gather their things. The usual buzz of voices filled the air, and people began standing, reaching for their overhead bins and pulling down their bags. Angela, however, took her time. She wasn't in a rush. She looked out the window one last time, watching as the airport came into full view. There was something special about arriving at a destination, knowing that the journey had shaped who you were just a little bit more. She had come into this flight with a certain goal: to protect her space, her dignity, and her peace. And now she was walking off this plane knowing that she had done just that. As she unbuckled her seatbelt and stood up, she noticed the man who had caused so much trouble earlier. He was still sitting in his seat, waiting for the aisle to clear before he could leave. His expression was calmer now, and he seemed much more collected than when the flight had started. He wasn't trying to push past anyone or demand anything. He was simply waiting, just like everyone else. Angela paused for a moment, glancing back at him. There was a subtle change in the way he carried himself now. His earlier arrogance had faded, replaced by a quieter confidence, the kind that comes only from genuinely reflecting on one's actions. As she walked down the aisle toward the exit, she couldn't help but feel a small sense of pride. She had been a witness to his transformation, even if it had been subtle. The man had gone from demanding to understanding, from angry to self-aware. It was clear that the flight had been a wake-up call for him, and she hoped he would carry that lesson with him long after the plane had landed. As she stepped off the aircraft and into the busy terminal, Angela felt a wave of gratitude for the quiet strength she had shown throughout the journey. Sometimes it wasn't about the outcome, it was about staying true to yourself, even when faced with obstacles. The lesson wasn't just about dealing with others, it was about dealing with yourself, about having the strength to stand firm without sinking to the level of others. She gathered her bag and moved toward the baggage claim area, weaving through the crowd of passengers. It was late, and the terminal was less crowded now, but there was a calm energy in the air. People were tired but content, ready to be reunited with their luggage and head home. When Angela reached the baggage claim, she noticed the man again. He was standing by the carousel, waiting for his bag, and this time, he seemed to be making small talk with another passenger, a woman, likely a fellow traveler who had just landed. As he laughed at something the woman said, Angela caught his eye for just a moment. He smiled at her, a genuine, almost shy smile, and nodded in acknowledgement. It wasn't much, but it was enough. In that small exchange, Angela felt a sense of completion. The man had learned, perhaps not in the grandest way, but he had learned. He had learned to treat others with respect, and that was a victory in itself. As Angela grabbed her bag from the conveyor belt, she felt a quiet satisfaction. The flight had been challenging at times, but it had also been rewarding in its own way. It had been a reminder that sometimes standing up for what's right doesn't just protect you. It can also help someone else see things differently. She walked toward the exit of the terminal, taking one last glance at the man, who was now chatting comfortably with the woman. Things had worked out. Angela stepped out into the crisp night air, smiling to herself. There would be more challenges ahead, more lessons to be learned, but she was ready for them. She had made it through this one, and she had done so with grace. That was something she could be proud of. As she walked toward her car, she realized that this wasn't just about the flight. It was about every moment in life when we have the choice to rise above, to make the right choices, and to stand strong, no matter the situation. And in that, there was always room for growth. She smiled, knowing that this was just the beginning of a journey that would continue for a lifetime.